Captain Peter Cutsey, South Korea, and this is my briefing room. Threshold, runway 08 left, Muscat. The briefing is about a visual traffic pattern. We will fly a pattern at 1,500 feet above field elevation. Right-hand pattern, first officer will be pilot flying, captain will be pilot monitoring. The temperature at the field is plus 35 degrees Celsius. The surface wind 355 degrees at 30 knots. And at a 90-degree crosswind, using the formula 1/3 of the actual wind, our drift will be 10 degrees. So after liftoff, we will fly a heading of 073. And when we turn downwind, the pilot monitoring, which will be the captain, he will adjust the heading bug at 800 feet to the right. And once the turn is started, he will set the heading bug to 274 degrees to compensate for the wind to allow a rectangular pattern. At 800 feet above field elevation, the pilot flying will pitch down to 10 degrees above the horizon, put on 25 degrees of bank because of the tailwind, call for flaps 5, and start reducing the thrust to not exceed the white bug, which is the flap 5 speed. Pilot monitoring will raise the gear on the command of the pilot flying. The pilot monitoring will be the person who sets the heading bug. The pilot monitoring is the person who will select flaps 5 and monitor the pilot flying not to exceed flap 5 speed. At the same time, the pilot monitoring will select the auto brakes off to start with, and will leave the engine start switches in continuous and perform the after takeoff procedure and the after takeoff checklist with the modifications just mentioned. The whole intention of this maneuver is hand-eye coordination. Of course, it's done manually with no AFDS systems. So the pilot flying will call for everything that he wants done on the airplane. The pilot monitoring will respond and do it for him. Once downwind and tracking 264 with a heading of 274 degrees, the pilot flying will proceed to a beam, the landing threshold, and when the aircraft symbol is halfway through the beam radio, the pilot monitoring will start a 45-second timing. This timing is broken down into 20 seconds, then 40 seconds, then 45 seconds. At the end of the first 20 seconds, the pilot monitoring will call 20 seconds. The pilot flying will call gear down, flaps 15, speed brakes armed if a full stop, or speed brakes not armed if not a full stop. And the pilot monitoring will comply with that as briefed from the instrument pilot, or the instructor pilot, I should say. And the auto brakes off or selected on if it's a full stop. And that was briefed prior to takeoff by the instructor pilot. At the 40-second mark, the pilot will call for landing flap, in this case, flap 30. The pilot monitoring will select flaps 30 and select VREF plus 5 knots. At the 45-second mark, the pilot flying will turn 90 degrees to the extended center line using 25 degrees of bank and begin a descent when visual on the poppy. Once the 30-second trend vector touches the extended center line for runway 08 left, the pilot flying will begin a descending turn so as to keep the tip of the 30-second trend vector on, overlapping the extended center line. In this way, the pilot flying will end up wings level on the center line, somewhere between 500 and 700 feet above field elevation. The instructor pilot who will be on the flight deck would have directed the pilot flying and the pilot monitoring what type of landing. If it was to be a touch and go, as I mentioned before, downwind, speed brakes would not be armed, auto brakes would be off, and the instructor pilot would remind the pilot flying that upon touchdown, lower the nose wheel, do not select any reverse thrust, do not touch the braking of the aircraft. The instructor pilot will move the thrust levers to the vertical position. The instructor pilot will select flaps 15. The instructor pilot will ensure that the horizontal stab is set. And once this is complete and close to VREF, the instructor pilot will advise the pilot flying to rotate and continue on with the next traffic pattern. We took off runway 08 left at 800 feet after tracking the center line using a heading of 074 degrees. We turned right with 25 degrees of bank, pitched down to 10 degrees above the horizon, called for flaps 5. The pilot flying selected flaps 5, and he selected flaps 5 speed, which happens to be very close to the white bug, within 1 or 2 knots. Pilot flying reduced thrust progressively, initially to approximately 80%, then continued reducing thrust so as not to exceed the flaps 5 speed while turning. We ended up downwind in the position you see here. I have frozen the simulator so you can appreciate the wind at 90 degrees and using 1/3. Quick formula that I've shown you in one of my hundreds of videos on how to compute that. So this is where we're at, and we will continue flying the pattern shortly.